I'm Malcolm Bain, lawyer. Been working in IT law for 26 years. Since .com. Anybody remember .com? Yeah. And a small IT consultancy firm, these techie developers would come up to me and say, hey, what does DPL mean? Or what's this MIT thing? So I said, oh, it's just a license. I quickly have a quick look and I try and understand what it means. But this is back in 2002 when I really didn't know anything about it. So fast forward, it's been lots of years now working with open source projects, helping them do licensing, also lots of academics, which is a complete nightmare, as we all know, because they do lots of open source, but they don't know they're doing open source and they don't know how to do it. So one of the objectives today is a little bit about open source licensing for success. I'm not sure if it's a bit of an oversell, but we'll try and get there. It's probably the basic practical rules of how to do open source licensing in a way that supports sustainability and success, I suppose, both from an academic and a technological point of view. When I was looking at this, actually, I looked at the CURIOSS website to see what the latest thing is. And they published a paper, which I think was October last year, called, you're a co-author. I said you're lead author. You're first in the list, Richard. Yes. 10 simple rules for making your software outlive your job. As we know, there's a high rotation in academia. And actually in any enterprise, and obviously sustainability is a concern. I was really happy to see. I was chuffed. Stay within the law and then choose the licensing. I mean, that's basic stuff. So in the governance talk earlier on, I was thinking, and actually then Stephen answered much better than I would. Is governance for what? And I think the first thing is governance, so that you take the right decisions on those 10 simple rules.
What am I getting yelled at?
You're getting yelled at, but just speaking loudly so they can hear.
Oh, that's great. Cool. Thanks.
No, this is cool. This is really cool. Anyway, so licensing. If you're doing licensing, obviously, if you're going open source, the first thing to do is use license. Often not what happens, especially before even. Who's in the tech transfer office here? Okay, who's in the Northpole? Okay, how many people have a project that lands on their desk that's already been put on public GitHub? You see, without a license. Yeah. Okay. So we all know what happens. Okay. So actually, there's some basic rules, and it's very interesting to see that. Obviously, the legal part, which is do the licensing correctly, is one of the or two of the important rules. Yeah. Obviously, staying within the law has become more complex, as we've seen, because there's regulation. There's actually who is entitled to actually release the software. I have a case in Spain where a professor in a university published open source as a piece of research as open source, and then got in really into hot water because the dean or some other important person at the faculty had already kind of promised to do some exclusive tech transfer licensing to a private company. And then they suddenly found that it had been on GitHub for the last 2 years. So that was, and obviously, the professor, technically speaking, is not authorized to release the code, because the professor in Spain is not owner of the copyrights in the code, in that sense. Whereas not the case in Cambridge and other places where ownership may belong with faculty. So one of the first things is, am I allowed to release it? Who is allowed to release it? And who takes the decision of when, under what license, and how? Okay, so again, I'll repeat what I said in the other room. Open source is a software development model, and licensing is basically an infrastructure to enable that to happen. It's not the important thing. And I've seen so many people kind of focus on the license and do we do copyleft and GPL3, whatever. They're only really talking about one of the instruments that sustains, helps software development happen. And so the successful licensing, so licensing for success is not successful licensing. It's successful collaborative development after the technology leaves the university or leaves the entity and has its own, has its own wings and has its independent life. So, and licensing will help that, because the basic rule under copyright, what is the basic rule under copyright? Anybody know? Any lawyers in the room? Mario, what's the basic rule under copyright?
The basic rule?
Yes, exactly. It's copyright something, all rights reserved. Yeah, everyone's seen that? The law is by default, copyright is not granted. It belongs to the author or the owner of copyright. If there's no license, there's no right to do anything with a code. So The first, from a legal perspective, the first important point in licensing is have a license, because otherwise no one should touch the code. That's why I was asking actually Bastian in the other room in software heritage, is do they help us identify licenses associated with many open source packages? Because I still think there's 20% of code on GitHub which still doesn't have a license, which is very. Do you know? Has anybody read the small print of GitHub? Oh, you can do so. I'll have a test on Monday. What does it say about licensing? It says if there's no license, the default license is MIT. It's actually quite interesting. And as people all agree to the GitHub terms of service when they open a project, a thing, at least that was for a while. I know GitHub keeps changing its terms of service, but for a while they tried to solve the lack of license problem by putting a kind of like submarine license in the terms of service. Yes.
Or throwing a lawyer question back at you. If the individual didn't have the authority to release that to begin with, then by publishing on GitHub, the institution would still have recourse to validate that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Why? I think even before putting a license on the code is the question that was in the toolbox. Are you authorized to actually release the code? Okay, so that's absolutely essential. Okay, and what code? Because you've got these, European research projects where you've got 3, 4, 5 different people. You've got joint works. How do you determine that joint ownership? Or do you have to wait right until the end of the project when someone actually, in the end, a lawyer comes up with some joint ownership agreement, and the code's been on GitHub for the last 2 years, and no decision was taken. It was just, the PI, the researcher said, we're going to use the VAZ.
I think an interesting kind of overlap with that click-through kind of MIT license you mentioned is I was dealing with the functionality of GitHub, and I had a PI ask me, hey, can I set up my GitHub so it can't be, can I set up my code so it can't be forked? I don't want my repository forked. And there's nothing, if you have a public repository in GitHub, then it by default, there's no setting that you can do to prevent it from being forked. So I think that's an interesting overlap between that default MIT setting, which I didn't know about.
Is it still there?
Quite good. Yeah, I mean,
it was there.
Even if it was there forever, we would do. That's so interesting. But yeah, I think that falls quite in line with the software itself, its functionality is built to be forked. And if someone comes to you and says, hey, I don't want to do that, they're all of a sudden not doing open source.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the whole point of doing open source is enabling this.
You know that.
The other setting on GitHub, I think it's on GitHub now, is when you open a project, the repository, there's a wizard that asks you what license. So you have to step through. So if someone doesn't put a license, I think they're kind of consciously saying, I'm not going to put a license on this code, which is absolutely crazy. Okay, so, but again, you should, choosing a license, it really comes, it's after the important things, which is deciding what is my technology, who is my community, what do I want to happen to this? And that often does not happen. Someone says, oh yeah, MIT, and just study MIT, and they suddenly realize that they've got hundreds of GPL copyleft dependencies, and they can't use the MIT. So it really does mean understanding the tech and the technology, the tech stack, and the community, I think, which are major factors in choosing what type of license, which you may not actually have any choice if you've got strong copyleft. Okay, so the important things about getting licensing right is that you do need a license. That's around the world. That's something within the international agreements, TRIPS, WIPO, copyright acts and everything. So all code, and not just code, all digital assets. I will now say probably need a license, because it's very difficult to say whether data, raw data itself actually needs a license. A data set will need a license, so an authorization to be using it. And this is where Hugging Face comes in, actually. Do not rely on any legal information on Hugging Face. It's, warning, because yes, they put models under an Apache license. We can debate whether the scope of Apache license could cover an AI model, the weights in the model, but that's probably okay, because they reference for work, which is an AI model is probably a type of work. But the data sets themselves, very strange to see data sets under an MIT license, for example, or they're better than licenses for data in terms of open database licenses, even the Creative Commons after 3.5. Because before 3.5, they didn't have any data kind of like considerations, it was just content. Since 3.5, now 4.0 is the standard. It has a whole set of terms about data licensing. So, as I said, if your project is an AI-based or machine learning project that has more than just code, and has a company one, has data, has other stuff. Think about the licensing in terms of what are we actually licensing? Is it software code? Easy, that's old hat, we know how to do that. Is it data? Is it something else? And then really that gets a bit more complicated.
Related question on Creative Commons. I have, in my reading and in some really ad hoc conversations with folks who are at Creative Commons, they have said that their initial intention for creating those, especially the early licenses, was not software. That was not the intention.
No, those big things that do not use Creative Commons as software.
Great. I'm happy that we're on the same page because I've gotten some pushback from other attorneys to say, no, I recommend that to my client all the time.
No, wait a second, wait. There's no mention of source code. There's no mention of
at all.
And the whole definition of adapted material, it just doesn't work. It's not designed for artistic.
Yeah, just wanted to say that to this group of people who all, I assume they may see that in your individual case.
And this, come back, often happens actually with scientific publication, because open science or whatever is science publication, the publication itself says, we want you to use Creative Commons license for publication, which means they put all the code and all the data that's associated to things under that same license. That just doesn't work. Or it may or may not work. It just leaves legal uncertainty. Right. And if you want reuse, you don't want legal uncertainty, because some lawyer sometimes can say, hey, that doesn't work. Okay. So, but I've seen more recently, I don't know if it's Elsevier or one of the journals, probably more software-oriented journals, they allow you to choose the license for the code and the data which is associated with the paper. At last. Yeah, so you have a paper which is under Creative Commons, non-derivative, whatever. You have the data under the ODVL or whatever, and if you have software reference implementation or something, it's under the MIT or whatever. You can't get better. That's absolutely got it right. I had a question. Two questions. You're first.
No, he was first.
It's related to Creative Commons. So, I do bring that up with the group a lot of you have all your documentation. If you consider Creative Commons for the documentation, we put all the documentations into the repo, so it's covered under the license we put in the repo. And then I just stare at them because I'm not a lawyer.
Listen, most software licenses says, some of them says the software which this license accompanies, in which case you'd imagine the license is only really applicable to software. Okay. Other ones, especially the more recent versions like MPL3, DPL3, whatever, MPL2, MPL3, they know this problem. They talk about the work, okay, and they have a fairly wide definition of what a work is, which could be positioned under copyright law, which means a scientific, literary, or artistic work, which includes documentation, for example, or it could actually be contractually defined in there. It says any digital asset or item to which this is associated. So technically, it will work. Okay, and there's kind of DPL is pretty much close to 60 terabyte in a sense, but it'd be very strange to apply DPL license to document. Okay, it is there's no default rule. It's better to have if you're opening a project and licensing for success, get your licensing information right in your README or in your licensing.txt and say the code is under this license, the documentation is under this license, and the data is under this license. Okay, and then don't just put it there. Put it actually in the headers of the code, in the comments or the headers of the code, or in the I don't know how you could actually put it in the database. Imagine there's some metadata on the data set which you could put that in there. Because if the source file gets disassociated from the repository, then you have no idea what the license is. This is kind of Ruby on Rails is terrible because they just put the MIT in the root of the repository, but the actual files themselves have no indication of copyright, license, or anything. Because they said, oh no, the tradition, the culture in our community is this MIT and it goes in the root. Doesn't help if things get disassociated. Okay? So licensing really is important. Get it right, or at least do something towards getting it right is things. It's also actually linking with the talk I did very briefly earlier on commercialization, and I get commercial. It's one of the critical factors of success in a commercial venture based on open source is the fact that the licensing is aligned and is done properly. The main reason being that when you have your first capital coming in, you have to speak to these horrible lawyers that do due diligence, and their first question is, who owns the code and what's the license? And so if you say, I don't know, and I don't know, then you're not going to get your 25 million seed capital financing, okay? Or you're very lucky if you do, okay? So it sounds, I spent 10 minutes just saying for the license, but it's really, really, really relevant, okay? 101 on licenses. Yeah, there are many open source licenses. How many of you have read an open source license? Come on, all of you, please. Listen to MIT, it's only 3 paragraphs long, okay? How many of you have read Article 7.8 of the GPL3. Nobody. Yeah, okay, Margaret. Okay, no, there's been several generations of licenses, as we know. There's numbers, it's the 3, 2, 1, 0, 4. There's the public licenses, the family of what we call public licenses, which are mostly copyleft licenses. Do I need to explain copyleft? I don't think so. No? Anybody doesn't understand what I mean when I say copyleft? Share and share alike. So if I redistribute, I must use the same license and give access to the source code to the next person down the chain. I don't have to make it available to everybody in the world. I just have to make it available to the next person in who I'm licensing to. Okay? So there's the GPL, OGPL, well, there's all these public licenses. Eclipse got very popular for some time. And then on the other hand, there's the permissive licenses, MIT, BSD being the first generation. Apache, lawyers got involved, got much longer. Has a patent clause in it, which is really important. So this is probably when you're looking at licensing, this is probably the two extremes that you're looking at. Are we going to go permissive, in which case, which license do we like? Are we going to go copyleft, and what type of copyleft do we want? So copyleft can be strong. The code and all derivative works of the code have to be under the same license. We copyleft, the code itself has to be copyleft, but derivative works or larger works can be released under any license. And then there's the AGPL, the GPL, which says it's not just distributing the code which triggers copyleft. It's also if you put it up on a server and make it available as a SaaS platform, then you also have to give that freedom to the user and make them have access to the source code. Okay, so this is the usual discussion. Is that your experience? Copyleft, not copyleft, the flavor of copyleft. So I think the difficulty I usually find is that the researchers, they're extremely bright, very clever people. They don't quite capture copyleft until you've had probably the third conversation with them about it. Or not. Some of them are being brought up on open source, and they've actually read the licenses and they read them better than I read them. But that's, I think, often a conversation we have with the research. And I think also the other conversation on permissive copyleft is not just what does the research group want or the PI who is there, but it's actually if we have a tech transfer opportunity, we have an exploitation, whatever it is, what does the market want? Not just what the community want, but what does the market want? The licensee, or if you're going to have a spin out that's building business based on that technology, how does the license affect the business? And some people will go, starting with GPL, because they think it's the strongest defense against competitive use of the code, until they suddenly realize that their code can be put up on a server, and GPL doesn't help at all. So that's probably the major discussion is once you've got past who can put the license and what let's put the license properly is what type of license and flavor of the month sometimes. AI licensing, I'll talk a little bit about that afterwards. Okay, so actually when you have this conversation, I kind of like to categorize this in three areas: probably technical, community, and legal and the community. Technical because obviously there are always dependencies, there are always sub-dependencies, there are always sub-dependencies. And if you ask your researchers, who asked the researchers for an SBOM? Who's asked the researchers for an inventory of things? How many just give you the first framework of what they use? And how many times do you have to go back to ask all the dependencies? Do they give you the source code? Do you have a central repository, centralized university GitLab or GitHub where they have to research, develop code? Would that be a best practice? Is it kind of my number one on my Father Christmas's wish list? All my researchers develop on GitHub. Or we've done it in Luxembourg. We've got that. First of all, because the university pays for the account, and secondly, actually, the biggest risk. If your researchers are not actually working on a repository, one, they've got no version control. Two, it's on a laptop, and three, if they leave, they take the code with them. So you have no sustainability, you have no permanency, you have no conservation, and that's probably assets. It's probably not the best under copyright. Okay, so and the great thing as a bit plastic is that the CTO of the OSPO, they do a mirror of everything that's on the development side. So they actually have a copy of all the code. So even if it gets taken down from the development side, they've kept traceability of what the code is there. And if they have kind of like copyleft obligations, so 3 years later, someone comes to them and say, "Oh, please can I have the source code of that?" they can say, oh yes, of course, here it is. I have this one prepared for you. Because they have the code on the repository. So, but anyway, going back to that, the good thing about having access to the repository is you can scan. Yeah, and if you do deep scanning, you can actually get all dependencies as well. So once it's built, before you compile, you try and get all those dependencies in because the researchers never know what's there. And even in the industry. And now I've done this for the automobile industry. And if you've ever had to deal with automotive, especially German automotive, it's like 100% is not enough. It has to be even more than 100% correct. Otherwise, you have problems. So, and that means that if you've got any copyleft in there, you have to kind of sit down and think about how does that copyleft affect me? Does it go all the way up into my code? And so I'm going to have to be GPL3 because I've got 3 GPL libraries in there. And the only one that's kind of it's possible is GPL3.
What do you do scanning with? Is there tools built into the kit?
Yeah, there's lots. Scan code is becoming kind of standard. It's an open source scanner.
Okay.
There's a whole tooling, scanning and open source compliance tooling group if you want to join them. And these are real heavy duty scanners and compliance people. It's a subgroup of OpenChain. So OpenChain was a standard that was promoted for the last 10 years and actually now is an ISO standard for open source compliance. Okay, so if you're open source compliant as an organization, that's fantastic because it means all the code that goes through your systems, they comply with the compliance requirements of OpenChain. The first of which is know your code. Yeah, and have all the artifacts and know the licensing and do your SBOM, your software bill of material. Okay, whether it's in SPDX, IconDX, or whatever. Okay, so the good thing is scan code is one, but there was Fossology. Anybody remember Fossology? It's still being used in Java for scanning Java things. There's also Ninka. There's a bunch of things. There's a really good one called ORT, which I think is open source resource toolkit. ORT. Look at it on GitHub. Okay, it like brings things together into a tool that is more usable. Okay, and I know that the maintainer, German guy Marcus, really good. He was happy to come and do a demonstration, show really how to do things. Okay, that'd be something really useful for Irish R&D. Okay, so know your dependencies. That's really important. The other thing is what does your software interact with? You know, are there APIs in there? Are the APIs so what's the difference between development time and production time? And the developers, the researchers at university, they probably don't talk about what happens in production because they have their own production environment. But when it goes out and gets transferred, goes into production environment, it's pulling in whole loads of other libraries. When it's actually run, then you've got even more dependencies, and you may need to take those into account. Okay, and this obviously usually means that having just the SBOM, the list of software dependencies, is not enough. You need to probably ask for the architecture, the diagram of how each part, because they suddenly say, oh, it's got all these GPL3 libraries. Okay, and then it's also got these Eclipse libraries. Oh, incompatible. You can't have Eclipse and GPL3 together. Yeah, but the architectures, you've got this module here, and they talk to each other, and this is on the client, this is on the server. And that solves your problem. Because you may have your client side on GPL3 and your servers under Eclipse. Okay, and that's how it works. That's an architecture. Okay, so, and this is a lawyer talking about architectures. Just this, I've been there. Okay, so then commissions are copied, so legal, that's technical. So what's like, you solve that, you've got that information in from the researchers or from the project, the software developers, you've got a good basis for actually for everything else. Well, the next step is choosing the license. And finally, as I said, downstream, especially in tech transfer, or suppose supporting tech transfer, think of what's happening for the next 5 years on your code. Is it abandonware? Are you building a community? Are you licensing to a company? Are you setting up a spin out that can be running the project? Because that actually really is really important. Because the license will affect how that company or those entities use that code and its degree of uptake in that sense. So it's not determinant. You could have copyleft. I mean, everyone's thought if you've been running an open source business model, you have to have copyleft like MySQL did, because otherwise everyone's going to copy your code and they're going to be your competitors. Well, in the end, actually, that happens, and that's great, because the more competitors there are in the market, there's money. You just have to be better and faster, that's all. And if you have the most skilled person, because you have university professors, then you have a competitive advantage in know-how, not in the code, okay? So that's important. It's also is your software kind of like protocol level for communications between machines or between cars, or is it kind of high level health application management? Where are you in the technology stack? what we've seen in the report I talked about earlier is that 75% of most of the successful commercial open source, so open source that had significant financial backing, it's in the stack, it's down there, it's core components. It's not really at application level. It may be because software tends to become more and more commodity, especially if it's under an open source license. And if you commoditize something, the price. Are there any economists in the room? Now, what's the pricing rule for a commodity? It's the marginal cost. Marginal cost pricing means what is the cost of the fabrication of the next unit? What is the cost of the fabrication of the next unit of software? Zero. Okay, so it means your marginal pricing is zero. So if your software becomes a commodity, you actually flatten the market, which is what Linux has done, for example, in operating systems, as regards the code, not as regards knowing how to run Linux, which is something totally different. Okay, so and I think that's one of what we're seeing is the economics of this is that a lot of successful commercial open source is when the code is fairly low down in the stack and is becoming a standard, becoming essential for implications, for protocols, for data management, or whatever. And that's where, for example, Mongo suddenly became very successful because everybody was using Mongo. Whereas previously there are hundreds of other databases, but it became the standard or the one that everybody was using. And shows they suddenly got lots of investment money because of that. Okay, so looking at licensing and Christian, how am I doing for time, Richard?
You're doing good. You got another 7 minutes. No, more than that, 12. Okay,
good. So I'm about finished. So, licensing for success, think of these things because I think they're really important. And as I said, they're not just legal issues, they're mainly technical and community issues because that's what's going to be driving the success of your code. Okay, so managing licensing, very short. Look at the inbound, look at the outbound. That's your main thing. Okay, look at compatibilities between all these software components. Okay, there are compatibility matrices. There's software that will help you sort out compatibility. Watch out for so code scanning. The first level is just saying what's in there. The second stage is analyzing the licenses and saying these ones are already compatible. Be really, really careful about false positives. I'm not mentioning any commercial software for this, but open source, you'll find the same library or code may be under 3 different licenses because it's in the MIT, then it gets slightly modified, or it gets bundled into something that's a BSD, and then the whole thing gets put into a GPL code. That's perfectly legitimate. And they're not changing the license, they're just embedding the code in a project under a different license. And the code scanner will pick up the GPL version when you suddenly realize that the original version actually was MIT and totally permissive. Okay, so do be careful, watch out for these scanners. And sometimes it has to be done manually to check the final view. Nearly always you're going to have to do some checking. SBOMs, become experts in SBOMs. Next year, I hope the CURIOSS people will say, we all know SBOMs, we love SBOMs. Okay, it's going to become absolutely essential when the CRA, the European CRA, because SBOMs are used for security, and they tell you what code is there because you have to have your vulnerability information, which is something you're also going to have to look at next year, or end of this year. It's not just what license is on the code, but what is the vulnerability information of that code. Okay, and SBOMs will help you with that. And then so the other things I've mentioned, thinking and handling it. Okay, pitfalls, no license, obviously the first one. Secondly, you don't know what's in there, no inventory. Third, incompatible, so things I've already said, but just quickly list them as pitfalls. Confusing available source and open source, confusing open access and open source. A lot of researchers say, yes, I want this to be open source for academic use only. Rule number 1 of open source division, no restrictions on use. Okay, so quite a lot of entities, they start with this kind of academic, non-commercial license, just to test the waters, to see if we can share with our scientific colleagues. But you're not really generating community. You're just kind of sharing with a few people. And maybe they're the only people who are going to touch the code, because it's so complex that no one's going to touch the code anyway. So that's fine. But if you actually really want to go out there and build open source, have the capacity for collaborative development, then ANC licenses are no good. Okay, I really do not recommend them, despite having drafted 1 or 2 myself. Okay, so be careful of these available sources. Llama, for example, Llama is an available source. It is not open source on the model, because it's not allowed to be used within the European Union, amongst other things. And I think there are numbers of petabytes or petatokens or whatever they call listed. Okay, so That's own code. That's old stuff. I could probably say this 10 years ago. Yeah, man.
Just a quick question before we move on to open source and AI.
Yeah, there's only one slide on that.
Oh, okay, cool.
It says don't do it.
I fully agree about like our goal should be like open source, and I think that's what we should be trying to push all our researchers to. 100% agree. The question came up to me recently from researchers saying, well, what if I have kind of two versions of I have a code that I think is kind of has my real special sauce in it, but I also have this other version of code that I'd be happy to let people fork and have them go at it and go nuts. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's classic dual licensing scenario or open core. So normally it would not happen at university because I don't think I've seen researchers want to work on two code bases. That may happen. But if you move that out into private enterprise and they wanted to build one of these businesses and get some funding on it, it's a classic open core or dual licensing model where the community version, let's say, is enough to generate a community, to get interest, traction, adoption, get some branding. And the sexy stuff, the secret source algorithm, is only really of interest to the few who are going to pay money for it. Okay, that creates tension because some of the community they actually want access to the sexy bit. You could do a deal and say, okay, so it's open source, the community version, it's enterprise for business, and in the middle, I can give access to the sexy bit community, to the sexy bits, but under an NDA or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, the whole thing about copyright is super flexible. So you have to do your due diligence to check if you can actually do that. Okay. The other thing actually in tech transfer, and this is kind of moving out of things, is there's a huge difference between the code that's developed at the university and the code that's going to go into production. And university code is probably spaghetti code. It's a proof of concept. It's just a test. So, and that can go open source because actually the hardened, straight industrialized version, refactored, or whatever it is a totally different beast. It could be in a totally different language. They change the language. And that's why industry is interested in that. Why you may have commercial licensing opportunities. Okay, and happy to have. But the trouble is, it's very difficult then to manage the code bases and to move contributions from the open into the hardened one. So you have to be careful on that kind of like division.
So it's not really a question, but it's a statement. We're recently having a discussion with a colleague about the value of software at a university, how to transact it. Because the reality is, A, so much code is being done by AI now, and B, it's spaghetti, so under.
Don't say neighborhood to researchers if you said spaghetti code. This is, there are 10 house rules on that one, definitely.
If you couldn't text, essentially.
Yeah.
So this is impacting actual transactions. In terms of like, do you give it for a nominal fee and then build know-how around it in terms of the algorithm?
Exactly.
It's not a question, but it's really a kind of an insight that's happening in the last few years. Has been
and also the software development cycle is so fast that even if they were going to use your university code for the first 6 months, within a year it's changed. And they've got extensions.
They come looking for a change
So
of
you're
life.
going to hang your tech transfer agreement on royalties. You've got a royalties to hang on something else. Not the code. Know-how, access to information, some consultancy stuff, some continuing research collaboration. But you can't hang your tech transfer agreement royalties on code. Do not. If you've got a patent, if you've got a patent, do open source licenses. This is of any value of your patent whatsoever, but it doesn't matter. Okay, so very briefly, because Rich is going to kick me out. 5 minutes. Okay, so open source AI. Actually, the version I left in Drive said so-called open source AI, because a lot of as this morning Saeed was saying, there's so much blur from industry saying, this is open source AI in multiple ways. No way. They may even put a real open source license on it. But does that mean that the AI itself, the whole kind of like, let's say the tool chain, is open? Because you have no idea how the boss. It's interesting that I think a lot of these people like DeepSeek, QN, Mistral, they do actually try and adhere to the kind of like open source hacks, wanting to share and release and enable people to at least use it, run it. But open source is more than just using and running for free. It's also actually studying, adapting, and sharing again. So how much, to say AI is open, to be able to achieve this study, adapt, which is why we had this discussion this morning about open source AI definition, which expanded not just on the code, but on the models, the weights, the big elephant in the room, which is data, because it's so difficult to release data or share data. So much data is confidential or personal data, or other restrictions on data. So it's big, and I'm sure most of your projects these days, 50% are AI based. You say not so much. Okay. You probably say no, it's 90%. Is that right? Yeah. No, okay. I'm not going to go into the issue of copyright in AI and AI generated code. That's for another. You can invite me again to another CURIOSS session. The question is, how do we license an AI? If we have an AI kind of a base technology, how do we license it? Okay. So in practice, what most people seem to be doing is putting a software license. Okay. So if you go on Hugging Face, most of the models out there are under an open source license. If it's under an open license, it's under the MIT, the Apache, IBM, GPL. I have no idea how you would apply copyleft to a model unless you retrained it. That would be considered derivative work of the original model incident. Copyleft goes through. You have a lot of lawyers saying that a model or a series of weights is not a copyrightable work, and therefore the concept of derivative work doesn't work in terms of models. Okay, so what happens in practice? Because the whole industry is jumped into AI. They love open source, so let's put open source licenses on there. Okay, if you're good academics, they probably publish the data as well, or at least they've listed the data that's being used. You've got a data card, model type. And with luck, you've got an open database license or a Creative Commons license on that data, or at least description of what you do. Okay, and as again, Said was saying, we're integrated with AI, we've got agent, we've got MCP. All those protocols, I think they're going to become part of the tools, and they're being opened up. Okay, so when you're looking at open, it's not as straightforward, of course, as open source licensing. We're seeing a push for responsible AI. So responsible AI is basically an open source license that says do not use this AI for these purposes. And these purposes are, no military, no deep fakes, no phishing, no cybersecurity hacks, no ethical considerations. But my ethics are the same as your ethics. Okay, so it's difficult, and then it makes it just fragments. It's really impossible to reuse Rail license unless you're in a Rail community where everybody is using that same Rail license. So that becomes difficult, and I don't think companies will touch it because a lot of those ethical considerations are really difficult, and you'll probably some horrible weaselly lawyer will come up and say, no, you're not complying with that. No, do no evil. You're making a profit, so you're being evil, or something like that. Okay, and the other thing about AI is regulatory compliance, and I won't go into there. The EU has got AI law, but I think many countries have AI law, and at the moment under the EU AI Act, there's an exemption for open source, academic open source. But that doesn't mean to say that if you want to do tech transfer, you want to do tech transfer success, which means you have to prepare the way for the company to be compliant. And the only people who know what's in that AI is your scientists, so you have to be there with them. Okay? So AI licensing, don't do it. There's a person there. You have to do it. Not everybody's just pretending they know and putting an open source license on it, and hopefully some open data licenses. But I think we've had another couple of years or more, even some court cases, just exactly what an AI model is and how we license that. Okay? The definition, I don't think many people are happy. It's probably a measure of success of the definition, but no one's happy. It means you found some consensus, and they're really only unhappy with small bits on the edges, which where the additions is. We had that discussion this morning with Said, who knows much more about it than I do. Okay, so there's no hard and fast rules for AI licensing. At the moment, I would say do the closest to requirements of open source license, a modern one. Don't go. You may go back to BSc, MIT because they're really well drafted, but it's an open, as I said, like to say, more questions and more doubts actually than actual questions. That's it for me. And I know it's short, but we had questions.